afternoon. Oh, that's loud. Thank you for coming along. Hopefully we're going to have a good, energized session and you're all nicely well fed after your lunch. Hopefully you've had your lunch because, there may not be any left later. We've got a great panel here today to have our discussion. The official title, Systems Thinking in Practice, Delivering Energy and Charging Infrastructure for Transport Decarbonisation, which sounds very grand. My name is Sarah Spink. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Lead at Midlands Connect. We have got with us today Phil Wycherley. He's going to give us a bit of details about what's going on up in the North East and his view on the world. He's from North East Combined Authority. We've got Matt, who's from AMI, Tom from East Midlands County Combined Authority, and John, who is the chair of the Climate Resilience Board. Now, they're all going to introduce themselves properly in a minute or two. But before we get on to that, we thought, why are we actually here? I've given you the official title, but actually, basically everything is connected. That's our issue. Everything is connected, and we need to make sure that things are connected in the right place at the right time so that nothing falls over, so that it all works, so that we hit those targets that we need to hit, and to make sure we're thinking about everything, because it's not just passenger transport, it's freight. I think John's going to touch on the fact as well, sorry for stealing your thunder here, that it's not necessarily all about transport, but in fairness, that's the bit some of us know about, so we'll go with that for now. But I'm sure we are going to wander into all sorts of areas within our discussions. What are we trying to do? What are the local authorities aiming to achieve? Are they different from local authority to local authority, or is there sort of a national target we're going to hit? What's the role of devolution in all of this? Local government reorganisation? What are the barriers? That's going to be an interesting one. What's stopping us hitting those targets? What's stopping us doing what we need to do? And where are the successes? We've had the transitional regional energy spatial plans sort of come out earlier this year. How are they helping? Are they guiding? Do they line up with other bits of guidance that are coming out in the transport world as well? Hopefully we'll find some of these things out. So without further ado, I will hand over to Phil to set the scene for us.
Thank you, Sarah. So let's see if this works. It does work. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of a confession as somebody at a transport conference. I am not a transport specialist. I'm not even an energy specialist. My role is to be the Director of Economic Growth and Innovation at the North East Combined Authority, and that requires me to kind of bring things together, work across a whole range of things, from culture, sport, housing, energy, regeneration, and really try and make the North East a better place, working very closely with my other directors. What I wanted to do was talk about and open this up by talking about three, what I've called mega trends, but they're really kind of mega problems, mega issues that are affecting us all. And it's really important that we don't think like in the silo as me as an economic development director or somebody working in industry, and we think about the fact that there are three things going on at the moment. One of those things is the shift to decarbonisation in transport and the shift to electrification in many things as we try and improve the quality of the environment and improve the quality of the energy mix. But the other challenge we've got alongside that is there's a rising energy demand, and I'm going to come on to that in the scene setter, that transport historically has been the largest user of energy, but not the largest user of electricity. But how we manage that together is going to be an interesting challenge that we'll have to work on. And then finally, what we're doing to support the energy transition, and we've got a lot to say about that in the North East. I thought I'd just put up some stats to kind of set the scene. So this is a graph that basically shows not electricity, but energy use by sector. And there are four sectors here, but the two interesting ones to look at are the blue line, which is industry, and the green line, which is transport. So at some point in the late 1970s, I think it's 1977, transport began to be the biggest user of energy in this country. But before then, it was industry, and industry has been a really, really important user of energy, and that's part of our deindustrialization journey as a country. That's part of us moving towards moving towards a service-based economy, but it's also down to the nature of transport, more air travel, more people with cars. And there's this really interesting spike around COVID, which just shows, I think, well, in my interpretation of it, how important air travel is to it. When during COVID, there wasn't very much air travel. When air travel comes back in, it goes back up again. But that, I think, is changing. That will change as we move towards more electricity. So here we take, this is another diagram which is not about overall energy, but the use of electricity. So in the UK, in the UK in 2024, this is the proportion used by different areas of the economy in terms of energy use. And there you see that despite being the biggest overall energy user, transport is a very, very small proportionate user of electricity. Only 4% is transport. Most of it is domestic, and also industry uses more electricity than transport uses, but uses less energy overall. I'm going to, as there's not very many of you, I'll do a little bit of a kind of pop quiz, because my next slide has the kind of shocking stat I found out when preparing to do this, which I think kind of really brings the problem home to me. So some of you might be energy experts, some of you might not be energy experts, but 40 gigawatt, the UK uses, on average, 40 gigawatts of power a day. And in Manchester, we use about 3 gigawatts of power in Greater Manchester. How much of that energy do we think is the total UK rail network in one day, on average? Anyone want to have a guess? 1%. Not 1%, higher than 1%. Oh, really? But in gigawatt terms. Oh. 16%. Now that is testing my maths. I think it's smaller than 16%, but in gigawatt terms, so it's about 4%. It's 1 gigawatt. So the UK rail network, which is about 50% electrified, uses 1 gigawatt a day. We've got a data center that's being built in Blythe, which is, albeit going to be the largest data center in the country. That is going to be using more energy, that one data center on the coast of Northumberland in our patch, than the entire UK rail network every day. And that, I think, is a really, really interesting stat and really demonstrates the challenge we've got. So whilst transport energy use has overtaken industry and is far higher than industry, electricity use is going to be competing. So as we go through the electrification of transport, it is competing with the rise of quite electricity-intensive sectors. And that could be data centers, that could be how we create more carbon-neutral fuels, such as e-fuels, and the demand on the grid is going to go up. So there's an organisation called NESO, which stands for, I think, the National Energy Supply Operator, or National Energy Strategic Operator. And that organisation, I work with closely as the regional, because I chair the regional, something called the Regional Energy Board. But that is working to work out both what the demand of energy is going to be in the future and the supply of energy that's required. So there's stuff on both sides in terms of us talking about the demand that's coming through, whether that's transport, whether that's data centres, whether that's something else, but also the role that the North East could play in terms of the supply of energy. And we are a potential big supplier of renewables, which I'll come on to. So we have, so in terms of the North East, we have a local growth plan like all the other regions do, but we've got a few things in our local growth plan. So it's not just about what my colleague Tobin Hughes is doing on transport. There's a whole bunch of things we have in our local growth plan, which is around addressing those three challenges. The first one is we are a centre alongside the West Midlands of the automotive industry. We're the only place in the country that has a battery factory at the moment, supplying JLR as well as Nissan in our region, actually. And we've got a fantastic, and I say that because there's at least 4 people in this room from that business. We have a fantastic rail manufacturing site in Newton Aycliffe with Hitachi, and we're also doing things around battery and electrification of vehicles with them and their supply chains. We also, our number one growth opportunity in the Northeast is offshore wind. So thinking back to the 40 gigawatts of power, we have the potential in the North Sea off the coast of the northeast of England with our 3 deep water ports, with Dogger Bank and other kind of shallower bits of the North Sea to generate around 18 gigawatts of power, which is nearly half of what through wind, which is nearly half the current UK demand, and is a big contributor to the government's target where they're looking to generate 50 gigawatts of power from offshore wind to meet all these rising energy demands. So we feel like through both through industry, the innovation through industry, and through innovation in the supply of energy, we're a really important region for answering some of these trends. And the last slide is just showing graphically what I've just said. So that area in red is off our coast that hasn't been untapped share in our area of opportunity, which our kind of 3 deep water ports can access. I just thought I'd put up those things as a provocation for us. Just kind of, that's my lens as a non-transport person, what I see. Just as a couple of other things that we're doing in the region, looking at the answers to this. We are like other regions, so our transport colleagues are looking to kind of roll out EV charging, and we've got a whole kind of program about that. Devolution's really helped with that. Through bus franchising, we're hoping to do more in terms of creating a whole kind of electric vehicle network. We have got a challenge in that, like probably colleagues in the East Midlands, that some of our areas are deeply rural, so it won't work for everywhere. And we're also working closely with Hitachi and the Port of Tyne around creating the kind of clean energy port of the future and e-fuels. So anyway, looking forward to the discussion. So back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Phil. Just before you find out who these gents are and they introduce themselves, just as a show of hands, who would consider themselves, you can be both, who would consider themselves an energy person in the room? Okay, so lots of people here to learn about energy. Who's a transport person? Okay, who thinks they're both? Okay, why aren't you on stage? Right, okay, so thanks ever so much for that, Phil. I was just trying to gauge that just so we can have a guess at what sort of questions we're going to get from the audience later on. So what I'm going to ask the panel now to do is to introduce themselves, tell us what you do, and tell me, this is your chance to have a rant. Tell me your biggest challenge at the moment. Tell you the thing that keeps you up at night, what you need to be fixed in this sphere. Matt.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Matt Gibson. I'm a technical director at Amey. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Amey. If you haven't, we're an engineering services company. What makes us unique is we work across the whole asset life cycle, and particularly keen on partnering with people to transform infrastructure as well as operate and maintain it for them. My background is systems engineering, systems thinking, and looking at how we can approach delivery and transformation in a systematic way. And trying to do things differently and hopefully better to how we have historically done them. In terms of my biggest challenge and trying to put an energy lens on things, I think in particularly a lot of the work I do is in rail. One of the challenges I see coming is the incorporation of batteries onto trains and battery fleets. That changes the relationship of the rail network as historically a demand on the grid to potentially feeding the grid as well. And the demand is different. It's not as easy to predict. The demand and the energy consumption and the return can be noisier, and you have a lot of new EMC issues around the way we manage that. Standards aren't really there at the minute to deal with large-scale battery charging of trains all in one place. That causes a lot of EMC issues. So I think that's, with the energy lens on, that's the thing that I think is a big worry at the minute. And
I'm going to touch on freight later, but I'm assuming you're mainly talking about passenger train services or both?
That comment is for both. I've done a lot of work on the passenger fleets, but that comment applies to both.
Thank you. Tom.
Afternoon all, my name's Tom Moody. I'm the Director of Transport for East Midlands County Combined Authority. East Midlands is a fantastic region which has 2 cities, a core city of Nottingham and a city in Derby, and 2 very large counties in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. So quite a diverse spatial area in terms of service, and it's very much been an area that's been pretty much on every metric underinvested in infrastructure, in highways maintenance, in public transport revenue provision. So in terms of my biggest challenge, I'd say that it's a fantastic opportunity that we have now an established combined authority. We've got a really proactive, knowledgeable mayor that's championing the region. But the challenge is that everyone wants to see improvement in every town and village and city all at the same time, which is obviously impossible. We've got to demonstrate some quick wins, but we've also got to find the time and space to build and grow. And it's obviously growth in a sustainable way. So energy constraints is something very close to where we need to be. We've got significant areas of opportunity and growth, but also, as I say, we've got towns and villages that have been left behind for decades. So whilst the purchase of an electric vehicle might be great for someone, actually other communities have been isolated and don't even have a bus service or a bus service every 3 hours. So we've got to raise the ambition, but we've got to demonstrate to the electorate, to the constituents, that we can hit the ground running as soon as possible.
So it's some pretty smart choices have got to be made about where you're going to invest and on what scale. Thank you. John.
Hi, yeah, so I'm representing the UK Road to Leadership Group that serves all 210 UK highway authorities. My specific board is Adaptation, Biodiversity and Climate Resilience, ABC. It's also got the D coming to it in terms of decarbonisation very shortly, for as long as we're allowed to say that word. Some officers, sadly, are not allowed to sit here and mention decarbonisation. They're not allowed to talk about climate change. And, well, I think we know where that one's going to go. But in terms of the day job, I'm currently coming to an end of a 3-year project with East Riding, which is also on the energy coast. Lots of wind turbines, and we've been looking at decarbonisation of UK highways, and specifically my project has been working on street lighting, where we spend a couple of billion quid a year, each and every year, putting up great big pieces of steel, turning the lights on through the night, when Lecky is actually cheap, and there's lots of it, and therein is perhaps something we can draw out as the debate goes on.
And Phil, is there anything to add that
Kind of
you haven't already
done my
said?
spiel. I would say the kind of 2 biggest challenges for us in a more kind of strategic sense are, number one, bandwidth. So in our roles, we're trying to deal with about 86 things at the same time, and they're all quite difficult. And there's different demands coming from either government, stakeholders, local authorities. And the second one is kind of how you navigate the choices through partnerships, because we are kind of a partnership body, so what we think might be the right answer, we need to kind of navigate that through with partners, and in any issue, they are the 2 challenges, and what we're talking about here is there's choices. Some of that's overlaid by politics, some of that's overlaid by you spend time and money on one thing, you can't spend time and money on another, so that's how I see the world.
It's an interesting one, because actually I was thinking the challenges from my perspective are all around that partnership, because journeys don't stop at borders. We don't sort of go, okay, I've left Nottinghamshire now, I need to do something different. So how do we ensure that we get that consistency across the region, the country? I thought I had a hard time with about 22 local sort of transport authorities, but you've got 210, you crack on. So I think that getting that consistency is really important, and I think that applies sort of on a grand scale with your sort of data centres, but on a smaller scale in terms of EV charging. I was chatting to someone in a rural area who was telling me that they've got everybody can get into I think it was Shropshire. Everybody can get into Shropshire, but there isn't enough charging points for them actually to get out again. So it's an interesting recruitment device for a county. But, so thanks, guys, and. Do you think these challenges, are they place specific to you? I mean, do you want to have any, is it something you think, well, okay, I'm having that issue, but I know they're also having that issue in Hampshire or in London? Or is it, this is my spot, I've got a big data centre, this is my issue? So do you think these things are we just talking about these, sort of, is it grid capacity, cost, the sort of same old that we sort of hear over and over again? Or is it geography specific? Phil?
I mean, so if it was the same everywhere, what would be the point of devolution? Because the answer would be the same everywhere, and I think it does vary from place to place. So if you look at the National Energy Strategy / Supply Organisation maps, you'll see that different parts of the country have different energy intensity. So some of the parts of the country have less or more energy demands. Some of them are nearer to sources of energy. Places are different. So like in the East Midlands, where you've got Nottingham and Derby, and then these big rural hinterland, we've got Tyne and Wear and Durham and huge rural hinterland as well. Whereas in Greater Manchester, they've got a few kind of rural areas, but predominantly it's a highly populated metropolitan area. So the challenges are different. The point that Tom raised around kind of the feeling underinvested in, feeling kind of the place people go through and don't, and you know, Greater Manchester and West Midlands might get the investment, but you don't. So I think you need those kind of strong regional voices to make the point about the place-specific messages. And also, I'd say, again, plug to Hitachi, there are kind of strategic businesses that are kind of more rooted in certain places. So, you know, Tom would probably say Rolls-Royce. So those types of partnerships also work better on a regional perspective, I think.
And Tom?
I think it is place-specific, but it's also time-specific when we're looking at growth. And you know, what is joining us is growth, isn't it? But actually growth is difficult, sustainable growth. And, you know, we've seen with big rail projects of the past, cancellations, etc., that consistency of where growth is going to be. And I think the benefit of having a combined authority and having a mayoral combined authority is that convening power of stabilising and bringing partners together to having that understanding of the pathway to growth, where the areas are, yes, but also when that growth will actually come about. And it will be different for different areas, as you say.
But again, we get back to that border issues, and we want to make sure that areas that don't necessarily have those mayoral combined authorities don't get left behind. So do you work with areas surrounding you, mayoral and or otherwise, to ensure that as well? Absolutely,
and I've actually come from an area which hasn't been devolved as yet. So at Cheshire East Council, it's challenging, and the support of the strategic transport authorities as well is quite important within that space. But you know, ultimately, the ambition is the same of the people that live in these areas. They want to see growth, and they want to see that sustainable growth. But how you actually map it out, whether it be within the constituent authority area or more broadly, that for me is a challenge that I don't think we've quite necessarily got right yet. But at some point, every area will be devolved, and you'll have that level of consistency.
You've got to take a while.
Yeah.
I think we were looking at one of the, hang on, I've got to get my acronym right here, the RESP maps, the Regional Energy Spatial Plan maps earlier, and actually looking at how they look against a combined authority, look against a local authority. The maps just don't align. And then factor on top of that your national highway sectors, your network rail sectors. Yeah. So how do we make that work, John?
Can I just look at this? I think from a UK perspective, mayoral boundaries are not geological boundaries. They are not boundaries that align with where the wind turbines are, and they may or may not have nuclear facilities within them, like Cumbria, or Sellafield in Cumbria as a reprocessing facility, or you look at where Drax is as buying, the sort of the wood chip stuff and the like. But if you look at where the demand is, I think there is a reality that we can produce substantial amounts of energy in certain parts of the UK. We have got a national grid, but just to be controversial, should we wait until Shropshire is fully energised before we unleash the opportunity that is already there in the northeast? And government did try and do this. They talked about like energy parks or something like that. That's not to say that we're going to turn off the power in Sheffield, but then again, you don't need the power in Sheffield as much because Network Rail won't give electrification of the Midland Main Line to Sheffield. They won't, despite that mayor talking about the absolute value of Leeds, Sheffield, and through the Midlands. So right now there is a political narrative that says, actually, there is a two-tier, there is a slow lane, and there's a fast lane. So when we look at it, let's just accept that. Let's not go on about it too much, but let's accept the fact that there are amazing opportunities with wind turbines right now. Currently, I am an energy junkie, and we're currently on 13.7 gigawatts. It's dipped a little bit because it's after lunch. The energy levels drop after lunch. What can we say? Okay, and we're importing a little bit from France. We always do. They've got a massive facility. But when it hits their peak time, we push stuff over to France. We're a net exporter of energy to the Republic of Ireland. So you look at this network that we've got a massive opportunity here, so long as maybe we accept the fact that there will be a bit of a slow lane for a short period of time, but that doesn't prevent us doing all that we can where the opportunity is presented right now, where the transition is possible right now. But we need to be cognizant as policymakers that we can't leave people behind too long. But if we wait for the slowest to come on, we'll have totally missed the boat in terms of the opportunity that's there. And I'm deliberately intending to be a bit controversial there.
Phil?
Not controversial, but provocative. I think there's two kind of things. The first being that I completely get kind of the way that the regions are divided if you're looking at the world from an energy perspective. In combined authorities, we've created mayors that have the only people that are elected by all the people in that wider region. But in our own area, we've got 2 police force areas. We've got different partnerships with Department for Education. We've got this. There's just so many overlapping geographies that you wouldn't, if you were designing it from scratch, you wouldn't do it in exactly that way, because I think the challenge, is how you honour that, but also make sure there's a kind of strong political regional voice driving kind of what the energy demands and growth are in the region. So the way we have to do that pragmatically is to work with I've got some more acronyms coming that I'm going to have to remember what they're called. The thing that NESO is, I've tried to describe different ways several times. We've also got our spatial plan for the region, so our strategic development strategy. And we're one of the few regions that are kind of forging ahead in the north on that, which is looking at kind of where the big regen sites are going to be, including those that are going to unlock energy growth, but also industry demand. And the other provocation that you made me think, and I think it's just because I'm triggered, because I'm a man that lives in the northeast, but is actually from the West Midlands, so I travel on the non-electrified line quite a lot, and it's terrible. And it's okay to get from our region to London. Yeah. It's really hard to get from our region to or Scotland and Yorkshire, but it's really hard to get, other than up and down the East Coast, it's a massive, massive drain to get between those places, which is a drain on all our economies.
And in fairness...
And that's linked to energy.
I was going to say, well, we're sort of veering off the energy. I mean, the east-west connectivity is something that I've been focused on for 10 years, trying to improve that. You know, whether it be the A5, the A500...
But the link to electrification is one of the barriers to that happening.
Yeah. Now, we're saying that the energy's there, but is it... So it's not necessarily the lack of energy that's the limiting factor in transport decarbonisation. What we're sort of starting to suggest here is that infrastructure in place. Is that what we're saying?
I think it varies depending on the mode you're talking about. I think I would agree, in fact, in almost every mode, I don't think energy availability is the limiting factor. I think it depends on the scale of the thing you're talking about. A couple of examples, if you consider a mass transit system, the blockers there are capital investment and the time that's needed to do it. But then if you come down to the other end and you look at a new EV charging facility, yes, actually getting it built, the energy supply might be, and the connection might be a limiting factor to making that happen, but it doesn't necessarily drive directly that decarbonisation of private vehicles. Just because the charging is available isn't going to drive that mode shift. Whereas actually providing a mode that doesn't exist today is, in my view, much more likely to drive a mode shift because people will use it because it's new. But just because there's charging there isn't going to force it. Everyone's not going to suddenly sell their cars just because the charging is suddenly available. So I think there's a subtlety in the modes and whether it's actually a blocker or whether it's an enabler.
I think that the policy also has to keep up with the technology. We've had projects with electric vehicle infrastructure charging, where, you know, by the time the policy comes out saying you will implement 17X, X has gone. X was 2 years ago. We're now on to the next thing, and X is no longer being built because the technology has moved on so quickly. So I think there needs to be flexibility within policy to embrace that new technology sort of where it exists. Tom?
I mean, I think for me, there's a big behavioural consumer element to this, because whilst we can put on a fleet of electric buses, as we will do, if those buses are, you know, a quarter filled for the most of the time, then we're failing ultimately. You know, you could probably make a case to have a conventional bus, which is, you know, better filled and better deployed. So whilst absolutely we need to have sustainable choices, the starting point really is with the consumer to make them aware and create that demand. But actually, from a vehicle perspective, you want to fill the vehicle up, don't you, ultimately?
Absolutely. I think it's a really, really important point. I can remember doing some stuff, it must be 20, 30 years ago at Heathrow, and we were converting people from using their car, staff mainly, and these were very affluent sort of pilots and cabin crews and stuff like that. And we were saying, look, you know, it's just get them onto the bus. The buses are out there, and it doesn't matter. Back then, it was like Euro 2, Euro 3 types of buses, because I am that old. And you look at it and say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be brand spanking new vehicles. If you've got a fully loaded double-decker bus, and it's, I'm going to be deliberately facetious, and it's pumping out soot, that is still a better position than every single one of them being in a car of a typical age in the UK. Now, what we have got, and this is where I'm going to be provocative, here in Greater Manchester, massive investment by Mayor Burnham in electric buses. You look at it and say, actually, there are still parts of the periphery of Greater Manchester that don't have the level of frequency of buses that they need. If you look at some of the conversations that Mayor Coppard was looking at, they're struggling even to get buses in, let alone sinking, you know, what is it, 250,000 pounds for an electric bus or something like that, or even more. You look at that, that's a large opportunity cost with it. So I think, you know, we have to recognise the fact that we're on a journey, but we don't have to dial up one particular initiative at the expense of everything else. And that is the classic policy decision that as officers, we need to support members in having that informed discussion.
So essentially it needs to be sort of a more, we can't go mode specific, it has to be more rounded.
I think to me that the focus needs to be on what you're trying to achieve. And that is a blend of modes, and the aim is to get people to shift to decarbonised transport, whatever that is. Just because we make the buses electric doesn't force the people onto the buses. So I think it's you know, there's panels this morning about AI, a similar problem. It's focus on the problem you're trying to solve before you work out what the solution is. And I think that's it. That applies equally to this.
So it's the cliches. It's outcomes, not outputs.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Modally agnostic, I think, is the other one. So I'm just going to just to get a view from the audience here. I'm going to give you 4 options, and I'm going to be a little modal here. So tell me what's sort of keeping you up at night, and I'll tell you them beforehand, so you can make your mind where your vote's going. What keeps you up at night? Bus charging and bus depots, HGV charging, mass transit, rail electrification, or public sort of electric vehicle charging. So everybody gets a vote, including you, Phil. So what do you think is the most pressing problem? And yes, I know we need to solve them all, and I know it's a bit of a cop-out to sort of try and make you choose one. So who thinks that bus depots are the biggest problem we've got to solve right now? Okay. What about HGV charging? Yeah, I am going to touch on freight in a minute because I've got a great stat that I want to throw in. Mass transit, rail. Oh, a few more. Okay. And public EV charging. So I think the public EV charging actually picks it up slightly more than the rail. Do you agree with the audience there?
From an energy perspective, if you've solely focused on energy and decarbonisation, yeah.
Getting the EVs, getting that conversion to EVs.
I'd have been tempted to say a 5th one, but then again, that's me. And I think domestic charging, I think we know that if you've got a driveway, then you've immediately got the opportunity. and yet some of the biggest challenge will be in areas where it's terraced properties, and that doesn't matter whether it's a £1 million terraced property in London or a 50,000 terraced house in Page or in Sheffield or something like that. You need to find how to achieve that. Now, there are initiatives. The Gull-E that Oxford did, the recent initiatives that the government has been talking about. It's easier where it's just across the blacktop through the asphalt to chase and put that in there. I think there's a neat little transition out there. But I think realistically, you only need public charging when you've not got the domestic. And realistically, not everyone needs to have a petrol filling station underneath their house. So not everybody always needs to have the charge and the car. You don't have to be driving around with a fully charged EV. So I think it is that blend between community charging facilities at a domestic rate
I think that's the key on that
rather
one.
than
It's the
more in the public car park.
So
Sorry, Phil.
if we were sitting here at an SMMT conference, and SMMT stands for the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, and I know this because we obviously interact with that sector. I used to work on automotive as well when in government. The biggest challenge facing that sector, is not making as much money as it could and having problems with that transition, which is partly why the Jaguar Land Rover, Nissan kind of retention, keeping them in the country issues flowing, is because people aren't transitioning to EVs fast enough for that sector. So they know that they've got targets to meet, but they're losing money, or they're not making as much money trying to dual run petrol cars and electric cars. So making it easier for consumers to make the decision to have an electric vehicle rather than a petrol vehicle is a huge, huge part of this trend. So it's not just about having the charging network. I hold my hand up. I was an early adopter to EVs, and it is significantly, extremely, a lot better now than it was, and that is improving, motorway service networks included. But unless we get to a place where people are comfortable to make that decision, both financially and culturally, because they feel comfortable, then you're not going to make a shift. And I think electric chargers are part of the answer, but they're not the only part of the answer.
And I think you were right about that, the rate at which they're charged, because you don't want to penalise people because they don't have a driveway, essentially. So, why should you have to pay more because you've gone to a public facility?
Yeah.
I think that's where the systems thinking approach comes in, because what we need to do is manage that at a regional and national level. And you've got, again, it was talked about in one of the panels yesterday, I think you've got car manufacturers starting to have across their whole portfolio of models that they offer, systems where they try and balance that at a national level. And I think Octopus are doing it as well from what they do. So it's and smart charging where they don't all come on together, and sometimes actually it might charge and then discharge overnight because someone else needs some power, and then it'll charge it again because it knows it needs to be ready at 6 a.m. because you've got to go to work and you've told it that. And I think how we get there is the big challenge from an EV perspective.
Now, going back into this sort of partnership thing we were talking about earlier, how does the sort of public sector, private sector work here? Because, it's all very well for Tom and Phil to sort of say, well, my job encompasses energy as well as transport, or transport as well as energy, or growth as well as everything, I think, as well. I think both of you sort of have a foot in that camp as well. So where does the private sector come into this? Is it fully on the public sector to lead the charge, or are we expecting the private sector to run with this?
I think, if I can comment, so I think we need to think about it holistically and in a complementary fashion. So under my remit will be the deployment of publicly accessible charging infrastructure for individuals that don't have access at home. But it needs to complement, from a travel behaviour perspective, one of the other examples, which was the electrification of rail, and your experiences, are not uncommon, and I have the same experiences. It's just not good enough, is it? And the proposition from a passenger perspective must be better, but how that complements each other is the bit which is really critical, because certain trips it can be completed from a private car uses perspective, but ultimately my job from a public transport perspective is to get more bums on seats. Bums on seats on rail, bums on seats on bus. And the revenue gap on both those industries is significant, and that's where the public purse comes in. because ultimately that's been funded one way or another, by taxation take.
I think ultimately the public has got to lead this. The benefits of a decarbonised world are there for anyone who is prepared to wake up and smell the coffee, okay? So it is obvious that we need to do something, and it falls to the state, nationally and locally, to provide that transition. And I think where we can, we should, we must, and we must redouble our efforts. Where we can't right now, let's not hold ourselves up on that. And that links back to the point that I said earlier. But I think there's actually a wider benefit as well in that if you've got a great big battery bank, I was playing with my phone earlier, I wanted to try and figure out sort of how much, sort of not gigawatts there were in the room of our phones, but if we look at the entire battery power that is currently interchange, or in the UK, or you look at the amount of battery power that there is on the driveway. Now, when you look at that, at present, everything's been from grid to vehicle. There was a power outage a few weeks ago, and the person realised they got one of these cars that actually did the reverse, so it could do vehicle to load. And they got the little plugged in, and they and the neighbours were sort of boiling their kettles and charging up their medical devices and stuff like that, which is brilliant. So when you look at it, and you do have to, and including the title for me, resilience, I look at all hazard resilience. You look at space weather, you look also not just at hazard, but look at threat. Okay? And you start to look at it and say, if we've got a great big battery pack on our driveway, and we've got solar power on our roofs, well, isn't that brilliant? Because we've actually got something there that actually creates a degree of resilience that we never had 80 years ago when the last time we were at war. So it creates a far more dispersed and disaggregated network of something that is absolutely essential. And let's not forget, energy and transport are very similar. They're derived demand. Yeah? The energy is derived from us requiring it for another purpose, just as for most people, unless they're going to settle Carlisle on one of those steam puffer trains, they're doing it for a particular reason, because they want to travel into Doncaster or Derby.
Just to put might be interesting to put a sort of private sector lens on it. Absolutely agree. From a clienting perspective, the clients hold the risk here, ultimately, in terms of it's their accountability to achieve the change. So the client holds the risk, and you can't ever contract that risk away. But I think we can be smarter about how we manage that risk with industry. And I wanted to just bring up what I think is a really positive example of how that's happened on the Core Valley lines in Wales. I often tell people it's the best project you've never heard of, but Amy have partnered with Transport for Wales, which is a devolved authority, to transform the railways in and around Cardiff from a very, very old and unloved mainline railway into a decarbonised metro service. And that's been going now for about seven-ish years, and it's nearly done. But the way that came to market was to help effectively to contract with the client to achieve 5 outputs, or outcomes, should I say, outcomes, which was journey time reduction, capacity increase, decarbonisation, access, and then extendability of the network. And that was it. And that is, it's a bit more to it than that, but fundamentally our contract is to achieve that with a budget. And that changes the way you can deliver. It changes the relationship, changes how quickly you can realise value, how reactive you can be to change in the economy, in markets, in technology, and it increases the pace that you can achieve things. So there's a lot of benefits to that. And I think if you look at how you manage, partner with people to manage that risk together instead of letting scope. The problem is if you let scope, you get what you let. But if you manage risk, you can work together better.
So Matt's getting ahead of my question there, because I was going to ask him what's working. But before I do that, I want to give you, put your thinking hats on, because in about 5 minutes, I am going to come to the audience to see if there's any questions from you. So what's working, what's good, and has sort of devolution helped with this by bringing things together?
Well, as I just said, in some cases, and I think the opportunity is there. I think the challenge is still how funding is released and investment cycles from government down support that. That's always the biggest constraint if you haven't got that visibility of that. it's very difficult to do things differently.
What about where you've seen things working elsewhere abroad, good case studies where you've seen actually that sort of link between energy and transport has really helped with this sort of decarbonisation programme?
I think in many respects they're in the same boat as we are.
Okay.
It is that struggle between, what is public, what is private, what is that transition. I think this is hard. I think it really is hard because you have got, certainly in terms of decarbonisation of private vehicles, it is the second biggest asset, the second biggest drain on your family after, I was going to say houses, but after children. It is very, very expensive. This stuff is very hard. When you look at the way in which canals took a couple of 100 years, railways took 150 years, we have motorways that came along sort of 60, 70 years ago, and national highways in the meeting earlier demanding yet more money. Because they suddenly realise that assets deteriorate, just like we've been talking about in local government for many years, saying, please, can you spruce the place up? So I think there are those multiple challenges. I think that the point that I would come back to, though, is that I'm not sure that devolution is necessarily the scale at which we're talking about a national commodity, a national grid, but similarly, that conversation about every house that's got a south-facing slope that should have a free solar panel put on it to create that energy, to make the energy transition easier, cheaper, and to connect people with a commodity that is invisible. You can't see it. I was going to say you can't feel it. If you can feel it, it does hurt a little bit.
And actually, with that, it's almost a resilience side of it, both using the car as the battery. I've got this vision of people having, woohoo, I've got a battery car, I can boil my kettle. It's a resilience side of things as well. And, we're seeing at the moment the instability of energy markets. That's a good phrase, wasn't it? About what's going on. So what's the one thing you think the government could do right now? What would you like to see happen?
So the one thing we would like the government to do is, in the North East specifically, is enable us to unlock the 18 gigawatts a day of power in the North Sea by the Crown Estates, allowing us to begin the process of leasing of that maritime land and real estate, because we know that there is a lot of untapped potential in terms of, we had the chair of Lloyd's come and speak at a conference in the North East on the energy sector, and the chair of Lloyd's said the North East is the most investable region in the country for offshore wind, and that is what we need to unlock it. And then that will be the answer to lots of jobs, so 15,000 new jobs, but also nearly half of the current gigawatt energy use, albeit it's variable. It will vary based on the wind, but it will be a really important part of the mix.
It's usually pretty windy out there.
Yeah, although I am also obsessed. I noticed you were looking at the National Grid app. I look at the organisation whose acronym is NESO's app, which has similar information. And I've become fascinated with it, because you look at different times, and sometimes wind's 60%, sometimes it's 10%. It varies.
Look, I think that for me is about reconnecting and understanding what is out there. And there are different times of day when there is spare capacity. And it's at that point, if you look over the course of 24 hours, there are points where you can and should push stuff down into the vehicle and push stuff back. I think battery storage, not just necessarily battery, because you're thinking of a great big thingy. There's different ways of doing it. Dinorwic hydro facility where they pump the water up and then it comes down whenever you. It used to be sort of Coronation Street, wasn't it, where you sort of had the breakdown and everyone flicked the kettle on. Yeah. But I think that reconnecting and understanding when that best time to put the washing machine on, to put the tumble dryer on, that kind of thing does require a bit of citizen education.
It's almost gamification to some extent, isn't it? And I think it's giving people that control.
And incentive, money.
Yeah.
I think now's the time to charge up.
You two, what do you think?
I was going to say, I really agree with that what you've just said there, John, because I think that battery storage and storing energy and not wasting energy is so important. Yeah. And the benefits that gives us, if we've got that stored energy, it allows us to effectively manage our peaks better and flatten the peaks. You know, the energy demand might be there, but if we've got the reserves, then we don't need to generate at that point, which helps everything, helps the decarbonisation, movement and so on. But the challenge is, as you say, how do you control that? Because from a resilience point of view, if people expect to be able to boil the kettle when they turn it on, how do you manage the risk of a peak occurring? And that's exactly how do you incentivize people to think differently and gamify it is a really good way of looking at it.
Tom, what's the one thing you'd like to see?
Mine's
the
maybe
government
not so
do?
much the sort of energy point, but devolution is part of the solution, but there's still national leadership required.
Okay.
And, we're seeing devolution, being promoted at pace, but there's support required through that devolution and also the opportunity to think a bit differently. And we saw a sort of signal from the last spending review on further, I don't want to call it road user charging, but pay per mile for electric vehicles. Now, whilst there's, the work behind that is still being underway, but there's probably quite a strong argument to say, well, where's that held and what's it actually being used for, rather than being disaggregated from central government in London. So I think, it's devolution it helps, but I think there's a further sort of shift there in thinking and support.
And I think there's an academic term called asymmetrical devolution, which I love, which basically sort of means devolution's happening everywhere, but at different rates and in different ways. And again, we need to have that in some level of consistency, I guess.
I think it's an interesting point in that the northeast want all that great opportunity that would go to the Crown or to UK Treasury, and they want to regionalise it and put all the windmills up and stuff like that and be deliberately facetious here. And you look at that and think, you know what, it's probably not wrong. Yeah. You look at it and say, if that is what is required to get those first 5 or 10 years off the blocks, then so be it. But in reality, the government auctions for energy has stimulated the market. I think there is for me, there's a crying shame that we've got this great big tidal range and we've not got anything that's stimulated tidal facilities. I think it's right, as Tom was talking about earlier, I think it's right that the government is starting to charge 2 to 3p per mile, or they set the signal that's going to happen, because we still need to pay for the costs that we incur. So actually, as a transport planner for 25, 30, 40 years, we've been looking for that holy grail to say, actually, if it is free at the point of use, people do not understand that the costs that they are incurring on themselves and others. But just to flip back and go back to the kettle, I was taught by a chap, Andy Hunt, years ago in Trafford, and he said, the kettle is the 4x4 of the home. So for me, I boil it once in the morning, I've got a 1.5 litre flask, pour it in there, and then I've got water instantly there. So there are simple things. So that's a bit too geekish. But then again, just like you, I've got the energy app that tells me right now we're 20.6% of our energy that's not decarbonised. It's coming from gas.
Right, thank you. We're going away with lots of ideas for apps, if nothing else. Have we got any questions from the audience? There's a mic there. We stunned you all into silence. Or you? Oh no, there's one over here. Lady with the blue scarf.
This might be a little bit unrelated, but I guess my question was how infrastructure extends, I guess, more in terms of combined authorities, especially in terms of to cycling infrastructure and active travel, and it goes back to that kind of putting the public first and behaviour change, and actually how much do you think that also relies on working with other authorities and local health authorities especially, because I think I heard earlier a large driver of the infrastructure for cycling in the Netherlands was originally based on the model for health, and I think whilst that sometimes, my question is sometimes, is the kind of opinion that it's too late now, because so much of the direction is sometimes into EV and things that still rely on electricity and those forms of energy production. But my question is kind of, can we get there and can we go in that direction? And is it possible? And yeah.
I think I'll pick up a little bit to start with, because I think this is actually almost a Whitehall question, isn't it? It's sort of saying, I mean, I know when we look at sort of business cases for transport infrastructure, it used to be, here you go, DFT, this is the business case, this is the BCR, but far more now we're looking at the strategic case. What does this bit of infrastructure do for housing? What does it do for health? What does it do for economic growth? How do you get, I mean, we spend our lives, whether it be combined authorities or subnational transport bodies, or we spend our lives getting people to work together, and yet they seem to struggle to get departments to work together in Whitehall. So essentially, I think that's what we do when we develop these cases. It's sort of saying, how does this benefit everybody? I think more and more that's what the strategic case looks at. How does it fulfill the region's ambitions or the authority's ambitions in different departments?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's a great question. It's absolutely not too late. I think, I mean, in my career, these have been challenging times, you know, post-pandemic, been quite polarizing. Transport's often used as a, you know, as a medium to sort of, you know, kick and push and pull politically one way or another. But, I mean, I would say like, our kids are not going to accept what we have right now. So it's absolutely not too late. I think active travel and the wider benefits, it's not just getting from A to B, as you say, that sort of health benefit, is absolutely fundamental. It's not every trip, of course, and you know, people aren't stupid, but that behavioural piece to paint the picture of actually a better way of living is really critical, and that's political leadership, that's officers and officials, and that ultimately that's the consumer and everyone here around the table to make that case.
And I think it's a case of provision as well, isn't it? You know, people, they don't want to get a bike because they don't think there's anywhere safe they can cycle. You know, it's not that they don't necessarily want to cycle, it's they don't feel safe doing it.
I think that's the thing, is how do you unblock it? How do you unblock it? And, you know, you can put, as I said, with the EV charging, just because you build the EV chargers doesn't mean they're going to be used. It's the same issue with the cycling. Yeah. How do you unblock it? How do you encourage that shift? And it's a much bigger, systematic socio problem that we have, and thinking that through and how you influence that is really key.
Phil?
So I'm going to bring a bit of a personal touch to the answer to this question. So I have my prized possession, which is a brilliant piece of British engineering, which is a Brompton, and I go literally everywhere on it. And I can tell the absolute massive gulf of differences in places in the northeast. I won't embarrass anywhere in Newcastle. That are way worse than other places like Sunderland. Greater Manchester's great for cycling. London's great for cycling, and you can really, really tell. Also that in London, loads of people use bikes. In Manchester, it's a few people. It varies, but it's in a mixed economy, isn't it, of different areas interpret it differently. Local councillors get very excited about cycle lanes, usually against them, and that's the barrier to the progress. But absolutely, yeah.
I've got time for one more quick question if there's one. Otherwise, I will give them a lady at the back over there.
Hiya, it's more of a question on how are the councils utilising their assets in terms of using it to develop the EV market and working with local planning authorities in terms of the planning department for planning for those change of uses and such likes, because I kind of do that for work and that seems to be a massive barrier at the moment.
So I'm going to give Tom and Phil a quick chance to respond on this.
I mean, I'm not a planner, but I think it's a good question. I think planning is absolutely one really key part of the solution to some of these issues, and making sure that you've got that level of consistency. I mean, within my patch now, there's a vast variety of different planning authorities, so some kind of broad consensus and consistency. Still, obviously, appreciating the local need and constraints, but planning is a big part of when we're talking about growth, whether it be housing growth, business growth, etc.
And I think we are seeing that now with sort of transport and spatial plans coming into play, aren't we? It's a case they are trying to bring the things together, but because for far too many years we've had planning developments that have needed where's the infrastructure, and infrastructure developments that have sort of said, well, where are the people, where's the volume? And they've always been chicken and egg.
So I'm not a planner, but I'm standing up a planning team because we're about to get statutory responsibilities for planning, which I will be the lead director for, and linked to our spatial development strategy. So and that's all on the kind of crusade of government for economic growth and the barriers that planning has brought to economic growth in the past. we are going through the challenge of building a planning team within the combined authority and working closely with others. I've poached some planners already from our local authorities. They love me for it. But I think one of, as an economic development person, I've constantly been frustrated with things happening too slowly and planning being part of that. So, but I recognise that we have to do things in the right way. But yeah.
Okay, right. Before we finish, one word from each of you. Who should be spearheading this? Is it national, local, regional?
Obviously, combined authorities.
Combined authorities. John.
You lose the kettle, get a flask.
There you go.
You'll think about it every day then.
So I want to say two, sorry. I think it's collaboration, and actually the fact that we're having the conversation is a positive first step. But the second bit, as we've sort of picked up on, is the consumer side. I don't think you can underestimate that.
Yeah.
I think it's similar. It's everyone. If all parties don't want to do it, then nothing's going to change. So you've all got to want to go in the same direction.
So thank you very much to my panel. I think, the things I've sort of picked up is visibility of outcomes. Make sure people know what you're aiming towards. It always seems to go back to behavioural change as well. How do we sort of get into that mindset? How do we get people to want to change? We've talked about resilience and storage and incentives. That's a different angle. It's all very well saying, you should do this, this, and this, but actually looking at, you're going to get benefits because you've got an electric car, but you'll also have benefits because you've got resilience in your network. You'll also have benefits because you'll be able to see that you're saving money. So I think there's a case of sort of saying that visibility, resilience is key to all this. Everybody's responsible, and we don't want to leave anybody behind, but we can't wait for everybody to be on the same page before we start. Does that about sum up?
Sounds good. Well done.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to the panel. So,